The year 2011 began with a wave of change sweeping across the Arab world. This phenomenon, widely known as the Arab Spring, first ignited in Tunisia. A young street vendor's self-immolation became a symbol of deep-seated frustration. This act sparked protests against unemployment, corruption, and authoritarian rule. This success story quickly spread, inspiring similar movements in Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and significantly Libya. For over 4 decades, Libyans had lived under the idiosyncratic and often brutal rule of Muammar Gaddafi. Many Libyans, particularly the younger generation, yearned for similar transformations in their own country. Satellite television channels, notably Al Jazeera, broadcast images of protests and revolutions across the Arab world directly into Libyan homes. Inspired by these regional successes, small-scale protests began to emerge in Libya in early February 2011. Muammar Gaddafi seized power in a military coup in 1969, overthrowing King Idris. His rule, spanning 42 years, was marked by a unique political ideology outlined in his Green Book. He called his system the Jamahiriya, or state of the masses, theoretically a form of direct democracy. In reality, it was a highly centralized, authoritarian state built around his cult of personality. Dissent was ruthlessly suppressed through a pervasive security apparatus. Political parties were banned, and any opposition was met with imprisonment, torture, or execution. Despite Libya's considerable oil wealth, many citizens experienced economic hardship and a lack of opportunity. On February 15, families of the victims protested outside the police headquarters. These demonstrations rapidly grew, fueled by calls for a day of rage on February 17. The protests escalated into demands for the downfall of Gaddafi's entire regime. The response from the security forces was swift and brutal, using tear gas and then live ammunition against the demonstrators. Gaddafi's regime responded to the burgeoning uprising with unmitigated violence. His security forces, including elite brigades commanded by his sons and foreign mercenaries, were deployed to quell the dissent. In cities across Libya, but particularly in the west where his control remained stronger, peaceful demonstrators were met with live ammunition, heavy machine guns, and even anti-aircraft weaponry turned on crowds. Reports emerged of snipers targeting protesters and indiscriminate shelling of residential areas in cities that had fallen, or were attempting to fall, out of government control. The sheer brutality of the regime's response had the opposite effect of what Gaddafi intended. Instead of quelling the protests, it galvanized the opposition and transformed a largely peaceful movement into an armed rebellion. Ordinary citizens, students, and professionals took up arms, often with little to no military training. Crucially, significant numbers of Libyan army soldiers and officers, particularly from the east, defected to the opposition, bringing with them their expertise and, in some cases, their equipment. These defectors and civilian volunteers began to form loosely organized rebel militias, determined to defend their communities and overthrow the dictator. The escalating violence and the imminent threat to Benghazi spurred the international community into action. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973. This authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians in Libya, including a no-fly zone. A coalition led by France, the UK, and the US launched military operations against Gaddafi's regime. The intervention, codenamed Operation Odyssey Dawn, began with airstrikes targeting Libyan air defenses. NATO's air campaign played a decisive role, neutralizing Gaddafi's air force and halting his offensive. In August 2011, rebel forces, aided by NATO, launched an offensive on Tripoli. After fierce fighting, Tripoli fell, forcing Gaddafi to flee. The fall of Muammar Gaddafi was met with euphoric celebrations across Libya. Decades of autocratic rule had ended, and the promise of a new democratic era seemed within grasp. However, this initial jubilation soon gave way to a sobering reality. Gaddafi's regime had systematically hollowed out state institutions, leaving behind a profound power vacuum. There was no effective national army, no independent judiciary, and no experienced civil service capable of managing the transition. The very structures needed to build a stable post-Gaddafi Libya were either non-existent or deeply compromised, creating an environment ripe for instability and chaos in the months and years that followed. A critical challenge that emerged almost immediately was the proliferation of armed militias. These groups, formed by ordinary citizens, defected soldiers, and various local factions, had been instrumental in overthrowing Gaddafi. They were heavily armed, often with weapons looted from state armories, and fiercely independent. While many were initially hailed as heroes of the revolution, they soon became a source of insecurity. Reluctant to disarm or integrate into a unified national security force that barely existed, these militias carved out local fiefdoms, controlling territory, resources, and even government ministries. In the initial years following Gaddafi's ouster, earnest attempts were made to establish a stable and democratic government. The NTC successfully oversaw Libya's first national elections in decades in July 2012, leading to the formation of the General National Congress, or GNC. This was a moment of considerable hope, with a high voter turnout and an optimistic international community looking on. However, the GNC soon became mired in political infighting. Deep-seated regional divisions, ideological clashes between Islamist-leaning and more secular or federalist factions, and the pervasive influence of powerful militias undermined its effectiveness and legitimacy from the outset. The task of drafting a new constitution also proved highly contentious and slow. The political landscape became increasingly polarized. Islamist-affiliated parties and militias, which had played a significant role in the revolution, gained considerable influence within the GNC, particularly those based in Tripoli and Misrata. This ascendance was viewed with suspicion and hostility by other factions, especially in the east of the country, which had long felt marginalized by Tripoli. The deep political division of 2014 quickly escalated into a full-blown armed conflict, often referred to as the Second Libyan Civil War. The main antagonists were, broadly, forces aligned with the Tripoli-based government and those loyal to the Tobruk-based House of Representatives. The latter found a powerful military leader in Khalifa Haftar, a former Gaddafi-era general who had defected in the 1980s and later returned during the 2011 revolution. In May 2014, Haftar launched Operation Dignity, ostensibly to rid Libya of Islamist extremist militias, and his Libyan National Army, or LNA, became the armed wing of the Tobruk government, gaining control over large swaths of eastern and southern Libya. This internal conflict rapidly attracted significant foreign intervention, transforming Libya into a complex proxy war. General Haftar and the LNA received substantial backing from a coalition of international and regional powers. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates provided military equipment, air support, and financial aid, viewing Haftar as a bulwark against political Islam and a potential stabilizing force. Russia also offered support, including mercenaries and political backing, seeking to expand its influence in the Mediterranean. Following Haftar's failed Tripoli offensive, international pressure for a ceasefire around Sirte intensified. In October 2020, the GNA and Haftar's LNA signed a UN-brokered ceasefire in Geneva. The agreement called for the withdrawal of foreign fighters and the resumption of political dialogue. Despite skepticism, the ceasefire largely held, offering hope for peace. The ceasefire paved the way for a renewed UN-led political process. The Libyan Political Dialogue Forum convened to unify the country. In February 2021, the LPDF selected the Government of National Unity, headed by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh. The GNU aimed to reunify institutions and prepare for elections in December 2021. The decade of conflict and instability since 2011 has exacted a devastating human toll on the Libyan people. Hundreds of thousands of Libyans have been forced to flee their homes, becoming internally displaced persons or IDPs within their own country. Many others have sought refuge in neighboring nations like Tunisia and Egypt, or have undertaken perilous journeys across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. Families have been torn apart, communities uprooted, and entire neighborhoods destroyed by fighting. The constant insecurity and lack of opportunity have created a pervasive sense of despair and uncertainty for a generation that once held such high hopes for a brighter future after Gaddafi. Beyond displacement, Libyans have endured a severe and protracted humanitarian crisis. The conflict has shattered the country's infrastructure, leading to chronic shortages of essential goods and services. Access to clean water, reliable electricity, and adequate food supplies is a daily struggle for many. The healthcare system, once relatively functional, has collapsed in many areas, with hospitals damaged or destroyed, medical supplies scarce, and healthcare workers often unpaid or having fled the country. This has left the population vulnerable to disease outbreaks and unable to access even basic medical care, dramatically worsening public health outcomes across the nation.